Well, in this time of global turmoil is what I call it, so to speak, it becomes very, very difficult to take a clear position as an individual as to where you stand. But I do, in a sense, want to take one, and that is my um, criticism of the Western press in regards to all the events unfolding. Because basically, what we're being told by mainstream media across the spectrum in the Western world, it boils down to one narrative. That narrative is that some enemy, namely terrorism, has emerged. We're fighting that enemy, and the historical connections are never, ever discussed. In other words, this goes way back to the overthrow of the government of Iran, a democratically elected government, which the British didn't like that. So they didn't want uh, this government to succeed because, in essence, they couldn't have the oil resources in that country for a penny. They actually were supposed to pay for it. They didn't like it. And so, in conjunction with the Americans, they instigated a coup in Iran. So, this goes back all the way back to 1956. And for me, this was the crucial point in terms of events going on now. Then we had, the Cold War and the American insistence on arming Islamist radical factions in Pakistan and Afghanistan in order to trap the Soviets into a war in that country, which they eventually, lost because their military expenditures reached such a level that the economy internally collapsed, and it wasn't really that great to begin with, but that added to it. And now, for some reason, after this collapse, the West felt so dominant and so superior to every other nation on earth that they went full blast into a robber baron mode, decimating the population of the Soviet Union at that time. The poverty rates absolutely soared to uh, unimaginable levels, and this was then, to some degree, stopped by the government of Putin, although he was brought into power by the very factions which had initiated this Western uh, sort of robber baron capitalism into their own country. Putin, in my opinion, is, he's not, Russia is not a democratic country. There are various factions vying for control, including the oligarchs who are either with Putin or against Putin. But in essence, when you're talking about global power plays, I do believe that Russia has legitimate security interests. They don't want their own population to rise up against them. Essentially, they want to have perhaps a market economy, but not one dominated entirely by the West and entirely by these neoliberal machinations where the winner takes all. That is what and perhaps I'm naive in thinking that, you know, it's possible, but first of all, Russia is no longer ruled by communists, and neither is China, by the way. And most Americans are totally ignorant about this. China's economy is essentially following the Western pattern, the Western market pattern. Only it realizes now that that comes with ups and downs. And so they're clamping down, and they're having their own dictatorial, autocratic machinations going on. And this exuberance, you might say, by this idea of free markets, unfettered free markets, and getting rid of government regulations, in fact, getting rid of governments altogether, because that seems to be the ultimate project of neoliberal policies, is to essentially construct a corporate structure over world economies in which people are merely numbers, and they're not seen as actual humans but as statistics, so to speak. And if you don't fit into that statistic, you're simply no longer counted. So that is something I wanted to say. As far as the next Friedman article is concerned, that is actually concerning the wars going on in the Middle East today. How these wars, and this is also not mentioned in the mainstream media in the West, were essentially instigated by Western powers. The destabilization of first Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Syria and Libya, may not be, let's say, a successful policy in terms of warfare. In fact, it has had disastrous consequences on the entire region. And these flows of refugees and immigrants flooding into Western Europe are the direct result of those Western interventions in these countries. This is coupled with deteriorating living conditions in the, to the east of West Europe, namely in Serbia, in Albania, everywhere where there is economic destabilization. These people want to escape, whether they're economic refugees or refugees from utter destruction and war. Essentially, it's all the same thing, because it boils down to people's basis of living a reasonably productive life. That carpet has been pulled out from under them. This is the reason for the economic refugees, and this is the reason for the wars in the Middle East, because these wars deal with raw power machinations of vastly greater entities than the populations themselves are able to control. There is there is some truth to the fact that we are entering an era which is post-democratic, you might say, post-democracy. Because everywhere you look, entities are arising, not from the bottom, but actually from the top down, in order to tell the populace what they are supposed to think, what they are supposed to do, and what their aspirations are supposed to be. And unfortunately, those in the middle class, not to mention the bottom, the poorest, are not okay with this. So this is going to be the focus of my next video, also pertaining to George Friedman's next article, which is very recent. It's from 2 days ago on Stratfor. And why this economic project of neoliberalism, in other words, opening up markets for major investors. And I can guarantee you, you're not one of those investors. You may think you are, because if you've got your little 401k or whatever, essentially this system is built on on fleeting sand, because it is a lie. It is a pyramid scheme, and it cannot continue indefinitely. It simply can't. The only way it can continue is to continue to propagate the lies and to give the illusion that there's actually something solid that we can work with. But the corruption at the highest levels, and this is where I disagree with libertarians. It is not just the governments which are corrupt. In fact, the governments are being corrupted by very powerful entities which are beyond the power of governments at this point, which essentially are bankrupting governments, both locally and nationally. And this is why you see this type of reactionism asserting national power once again in Europe, which of course is equally dangerous. But a supranatural entity consisting of global corporate power, banks and corporations, is not going to benefit humanity as long as that project is based on the belief that continuous growth on a planet with finite resources is the answer for our problems. This is simply not going to work in the long run. It will instigate even further resource wars. It will become barbaric, either through technological military means or a complete dumbing down of the populace via various, depoliticizing of anything in your life via entities such as YouTube, Google, Twitter, all the rest of it, which all is involved. All of these corporations are involved in how should I put this, into a sort of an idea mechanism that technology alone can solve the world's problems, which it will not be able to do, in my opinion. Technology has always been a double-edged sword. It has advantages and it has disadvantages. And it currently, all that we hear in the Western media is what a great advantage all this technology and all of our dependence on all of this has brought us. When in reality, even technology has its limits. And if it is to go the way we're going now, into the realm of artificial intelligence, the extraordinary development of robotics, to the detriment of, you might say, emotions, basically the illogical cohesion between actual humans, as damaging as that might be equally dangerous. So this is where I think we need to all take a step back and say, who needs a new iPhone every 2 years? What are we doing to the environment with all this? All this technology depends on limited amounts of precious metals, which are primarily coming from Africa and Asia. And these resources in themselves are also limited. So the wars in Africa and AFRICOM, as we call it in America. Well, most people don't even have never heard of it actually, but in America, this is the AFRICOM is the central command in Europe, which dominates, militarily on the African continent in order to secure more resources for all this technology, including, your little information balloons coming courtesy of Facebook and all of this. This technology is by no means benign. It is simply a new project in colonization of that continent, corrupt as it is. But, corruption, of course, exists everywhere, but we're actually fueling this corruption by doing this. And very few people are able to even see through it. So yeah, my next video is going to be the reading of George Friedman's next article, published a couple of days ago. So it should be quite instructive of how this man and essentially with it the entire American foreign policy establishment is basically, they're supporting this. And so not wholeheartedly, there are some factions like some radicals in the Republican Party, who simply just want to bomb shit. This is not where Friedman isn't necessarily coming from. He wants to use covert action in conjunction with economic pressure in order to bring other nations and other peoples to heel. And quite frankly, I believe that our lifestyles, particularly here in America, are not sustainable. We have so much planned obsolescence built into our lives that, basically we're trashing the planet at the expense of everybody else. And this needs to be a grassroots movement within the population itself, and it cannot be based on current technology. It cannot be based on Facebook and Google. It can't be based on any of that. It can work to change that culture, but at the same time, we have to recognize that all this material consumption that we're used to, I mean, aside of refrigeration and, perhaps some air conditioning when it gets really hot, aside from that, we don't need all this constantly changing technology at every turn, thanks to an ever exploding marketing economy, which is based on nothing other than convincing others that you should be doing this. Okay, that's it for right now. More later.